We know how things work. A member of the government said that if the commissioner of police, if he doesn't like the commissioner of police, he would not be commissioner of police. That statement was made openly. For the commissioner of police, you can imagine for the chief economist. Can you imagine? You think under that system that we live, you think any chief economist will ever stand up against the Minister of Finance and say, I do not think that is the right thing to do under that system into? Never. First of all, they'll be accused of whistleblowing, and they'll be accused of putting government secrets out. So this Central National Economic Fund gives no transparency, because it's really a government fund set up with government employees to do what government says. There's no independence there. There's no independence there. And that is how it is. And I want it, you can tell me it's a leap of faith. I'm not getting involved in why you want to set up your National Economic Fund Act. The member have spoken about it. But I'm saying, if you want to do it properly. If you want to do it with transparent. And if you want to involve people, involve more members of the private sector. Involve more independent people. But all these people you have there, they report to the Minister of Finance. So they cannot be autonomous. They cannot be independent. They have to go according to the dictates of the Minister of Finance, who is the boss. And that is the reality of the world that we live in, and that is the reality of the act that we have in front of us here. So you do your thing, because you're in government, you can do whatever you want. But that is just a mirage for transparency. It's just a mirage. Mr. Speaker, look at the functions of the National Economic Fund. One of them is to reduce government debt. And the Prime Minister said that the Ministry of Finance the Ministry of Finance can apply to a loan from the National Economic Fund. So the Director of Finance will apply to himself. The Ministry of Finance can apply to a loan from a National Economic Fund. So the Minister, the Director of Finance will apply for a loan from himself. He's the one who has to prepare the loan application through his PS, and send it to the board, where he himself will sit on the board. What? I mean, what is that? Where is the transparency? Where is it? Where is the transparency? And when you speak about that, what they do is they abuse you and call you all kind of names. Why isn't there more private sector or quasi-independent people in that board? Why is it the board of civil servants all reporting to the boss? And I'm not singling out who is the boss. The boss is the Minister of Finance. So this is just a mirage. It is just a flashing mirror to make good for not following the dictates of the original CIP Act. So you just do that. And I still ask the question, how much money was Range paid? Because in the Social and Economic Review, it said that part of the CIP proceeds, and we quote it now, part of the CIP proceeds were used to pay a developer. They were smart, they never said Range. And up to this day, the people of St. Lucia do not know. They do not know how much money was paid to Range developers. So, Mr. Speaker, the government can do what it wants, as they always say. They are the best brains, they are the best managers, they are experts. They can do what they want. The opposition will speak on issues that they think are not right. But the question is, if you want to do something, you want to appear to be transparent, and you want to appear to do things that are differently, come better than that. Don't appoint a board comprising all civil servants that report to you. Come better than that, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, in this regard, I understand the government's right to do whatever they want, but I'm saying that is just a mirage. It's just something that is done for cosmetic purposes and it serves absolutely no useful purpose because all the members of the board have to report to their boss. So their decisions will be based on what their boss says, who is, in that case, the Minister of Finance. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Ancillary Canneries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just a few very short points. Mr. Speaker, again, we see that simple things have been made very complicated by members of the opposition. And the more I spend time in this Honourable House, Mr. Speaker, the more disappointed I become by the level of contributions that we see from the other side. Mr. Speaker, a lot of reference was made here tonight about range, and I wasn't going to talk about range. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I try to do is to make sure that we preserve the names of investors and never include them in our politics. We can debate vigorously on the issues, but I think it becomes rather low when we attack investors. But, Mr. Speaker, this whole debate about range, and both of the speakers were in very strong defense of range. And it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, as to their true relationship with range. Mr. Speaker, you would recall development agreement with range, who bought, Mr. Speaker, by the way, lands in Black Bay, Mr. Speaker, at below market prices, at unprecedented levels. And so, Mr. Speaker, we see a very close relationship and correlation between the price of the land. It raises questions. Why were the lands sold just before the last general elections? Why it could not have waited, Mr. Speaker? Why in the middle of a campaign the previous administration found it so necessary to do a sweetheart deal with range development? And, Mr. Speaker, at the right time, I will expose the full gamut of incentives that they have given to range. I will expose, Mr. Speaker, at the right time, Mr. Speaker, right, the full slate of the terms in that agreement. But, Mr. Speaker, let's come back to the debate here, because I try my very best not to bring investors into this debate. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was clear in his explanation as it pertains to the functions of the establishment of the National Economic Fund. Mr. Speaker, he said that there was just a little clause, a few lines, Mr. Speaker, in the parent legislation, the CIP Act of 2015, which indicated, Mr. Speaker, that there is such a thing called the National Economic Development Fund. He went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that he didn't think that just mere reference of this fund was enough, Mr. Speaker, for the establishment of the fund. And so what he did, he took the time, went through the work of creating, Mr. Speaker, a separate piece of legislation to give the fund a lot more structure, a lot more solidity, a lot more meat, if you will, Mr. Speaker, so that the establishment of the National Economic Fund would not just be a one-liner, as is the case in Section 33 of the parent legislation, the CIP Act. And so he said, let us take our time, let us structure the management of the fund properly. And so this is what this attempts to do. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, in Section 20 of the Act, where it says that Section 33 of the Citizen by Investment Act of number 14 of 2015 is repealed. In Part 2 goes on to say, at the commencement of this Act, a reference in the Citizenship by Investment Act of number 14 of 2015 of the St. Lucia National Economic Development Fund is a reference to the fund established under this act. So more or less what this says, Mr. Speaker, is that we're taking the time to do it properly rather than just doing a rush job, if you will, or doing an improper job, Mr. Speaker. We've taken the time to structure proper legislation so that we can establish the fund in a proper manner. That's what we're doing. Mr. Speaker, you could look at the functionaries there, people that are on the board. There's not a single politician that we've put on the board. The Director of Finance is an automatic choice for the chairperson of the Act, Mr. Speaker. And the list goes on, and it highlights the Budget Director, the Chief Economist, Mr. Speaker. You have representatives from Invest St. Lucia and the Minister responsible for Commerce. You have a representative from the Attorney General's chambers. You have representatives from the private sector. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what we've heard from the member from Castries South, the only position that the minister appoints is one in the list of board members highlighted here, Mr. Speaker. So therefore we see, Mr. Speaker, that every effort was made to ensure that, one, we populate the board with a group of professionals instead of politicians. And that's absolutely and very clear, the intention here by just the structure of the board. Mr. Speaker, it was also said, I was listening and I was extremely disappointed, confused. The member continues to split here when he asks the question, what is a government-approved project? The interpretation of the Act is very clear what it is. It goes on to say what a government-approved project is. It's the norm, Mr. Speaker. And it says here in the interpretation, a government-approved capital project means an approved project declared under Section 4.2 of the Act. Section 4.2 of the Act says, Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of subsection 1 and B, the minister shall, after consultation with Cabinet by order published in the Gazette, declare a government-approved capital project. So it is very clear, member for Castries South. First of all, it will be gazetted, and then secondly, it is what the minister and the government, the cabinet of ministers deem necessary as a capital project. And so this is normal. A government comes in, here is a recurrent expenditure, and it says that in this financial year, we are going to spend X amount of money on what is called a capex. So this is our capital program for the year. We will be investing these new monies in these programs. It is the norm. I don't understand what the question really is. This is just splitting at hairs. We've got the business of the people to do. This is very simple, straightforward. And really, I know that you're trying hard, member, but you don't have to try so hard, right? It is a very simple matter. It's there in the interpretation. Take your time, read the Act, and I think you will see where we're coming from. You've been in this House, you've debated the appropriation bill, and what is so cumbersome about a government-approved capital project? Capital projects may vary from time to time. It is what the government of the day deems necessary. As a capital project, you might decide that it's a house you want to build. Someone might decide it's a guard hut at the Prime Minister's residence, as in the case that happened once. It may decide that we will build a wall at an MP's house, for example, from a retaining wall to stop land slippage, as was the case. And the member for Castries East can tell you all about that. And so it is projects that a government of the day, projects that government of the day, you see, Mr. Speaker, governments of the day deem necessary. Governments of the day deem necessary. So yes, member, we may decide to build a retaining wall again in Castries East for an MP. It happens. Now, Mr. Speaker, we should not, Mr. Speaker, come here to try and complicate very simple things. And so, Mr. Speaker, the question was also asked, Mr. Speaker, the question was asked, Mr. Speaker, why the government may use its own money to buy its own bonds. And you know, Mr. Speaker, yes, I'm new to this House, but I'm not a new viewer of the debate of this House. And I can remember very well, and Hansard will prove, the member for Viewford South is on this in record of saying that sometimes the market does not have appetite for our bonds. So that's a fact. And if I'm lying on you, Honorable Member, stand on a point of order and I'll withdraw the statement. But Hansard will show that while he was Minister of Finance, he has said and stated clearly that the market at times does not have appetite for St. Lucian bonds. Okay? And so, Mr. Speaker, that being the case, if government has a good cash flow position, then you can use the monies therefore to absorb the bonds that the market does not have the appetites to buy. Simple. So, secondly, Mr. Speaker, there are times that, for example, the bonds might be at an interest rate that the government might not be desirous of purchasing it at, and may decide to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, when you've got money, you can make strategic financial positions. Mr. Speaker, the member for Castries South, who I suspect is the CIP expert on this side, the member for Castries South indicated that there were no provisions for the staff. Mr. Speaker, it is implied here that there is a strong relationship between this legislation and the parent CIP legislation. There's already a CIP unit. This legislation, all it does, Mr. Speaker, all it does is that it empowers a board to manage the fund. That's all it does. It establishes a board, Mr. Speaker, to manage a fund. All the activities, administrative and otherwise, will be carried out, Mr. Speaker, will be carried out by the CIP unit. And that is very simple. So let us not complicate this. This is a very simple thing. You brought a hash-pash bill the last time, and we're trying to correct it. Just by your one-liner and making this, making a very weak reference to the CIP bill, we've given it solidity. We've now made this extremely solid, and we've given
Honorable
this
members.
very, very good meat. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I don't share the concerns raised by the members on the other side, and I want to congratulate the AG's office for putting together this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate our cabinet and our government for having the foresight for putting more structure to the Citizen by Investment, the National Economic Fund, Mr. Speaker. Not just a reference is being made, but we have had the foresight, Mr. Speaker, to go full steam ahead to establish legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, my support is given to this bill. Thank you.
Member for Castries office.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this bill because when I came to this honorable house, when the CIP legislation was first introduced, these were some of the same questions that we raised. But you see, Mr. Speaker, some members, when they're on one side of the house, they sing one tune. The same song, but they sing a different tune. When they're on the other side, they sing the same song with a different tune. They don't maintain the same tune or the same note on the same song. Huh? Mr. Speaker, The CIP legislation, I heard the member for Castries South, and I agree with my colleague from Ancillary Canneries. He seemed to have been the mastermind behind the CIP. After all, he was the one, Mr. Speaker, who was heading this whole program when it started. So I find it very strange that the simple legislation that is being presented is so foreign to him that he seems so lost in the whole process that he is clueless to even identify what a government capital project is. And let me lay the basis for this piece of legislation. I'm going back to the Principal Act. Section 33, under the heading, St. Lucia National Economic Fund. Now remember, this was legislation passed in this Honorable House in 2015. When the same member, who's the leader of the opposition today, the 4 members sitting in the row across there, Mr. Speaker, were all members sitting on this side of the House. And Mr. Speaker, the same people that they worked with from the AG's office are some of the same people that we are working with today. But this Labour Party, these members opposite Mr. Speaker, they have a way, they believe they have copyright on everything in this country. So once they are in government, everything they do is lawful. I heard the member earlier raising issues about when they give advice, we don't take the advice. You know, when I raised these same issues, what he said, Mr. Speaker, he said, legislation, there will always be amendments and there will always be changes. So let's pass it now and we will make the changes later on. But when this side of the House wants to pass a piece of legislation, they find every reason. So let's go to what they passed when the eyes on this side used to have it. Let's go to what they said. Here is what they propose for the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. 33.1. The St. Lucia National Economic Fund is established. That is what it is. That is the legislation. I will read it again, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the people of St. Lucia. Not will be established. So you want to play with words? Let's play with the words that you wrote. St. Lucia National Economic Fund, Section 33.1 of the Principal Act of the CIP. The St. Lucia National Economic Fund is established. That is your legislation. That is your legislation. Then, Section 2, Mr. Speaker, Section 2. Qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. So, Mr. Speaker, follow what I'm saying. I know the member for Castries South don't understand that because he did it. So conveniently, he doesn't understand it. So Section 243.2 says, qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. So, if I were to ask you the same question through you, Mr. Speaker, he was asking, what is a capital project? What is a government capital project? But the member for Ancillary Canneries has already answered him. So, if I ask, qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. You think if I want to find out what the qualifying investments are, I cannot find it out? Okay, you won't understand. Section 3, 33, subsection 3. The Minister for Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for the purpose. The Minister for Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for its approval the purpose to which the funds will be allocated. That is the extent. And the next thing on the, oh, there's nothing more on the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. We go to section 34, which is due diligence checks. So, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite came to this parliament, passed an act of parliament to establish an economic fund. And that is the extent of their legislation. 3 subsections made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. In a whole act, 5 lines. And then they want to criticize this government, who have now come to the parliament with legislation to replace section 33. With how many sections do we have there? Look at how many pages we have there, Mr. Speaker, of accompanying legislation, so that when somebody goes to the principal act to have a reference to the St. Lucia Economic Fund, they can get all of the explanations that are required for the establishment of this fund. Mr. Speaker, how complicated is that? I mean, for members opposite, who boast about 25 years in this parliament, those who have been prime minister for 3 terms, that is what they presented. Those who say they are constitutional lawyers and they understand everything about legal matters. But because the eyes used to have it on that side, they passed the legislation to suit themselves. And now they are talking about what is all of this about. Now, this legislation. So I need to read functions of the fund. Now remember, I tell you, they had 5 lines. Just under this part, here are the functions of the fund. To advance loans for government-approved capital projects. Okay? And I will come to the member for Castries South in a while. To provide investment for government-approved capital project, that is B. C. To reduce government debt. D. To purchase government bonds. And E. To provide monies for a purpose approved by cabinet that is not considered recurrent in nature. Now let's go to the bonds. And the member said, why would government use its money to buy bonds? Do you always withdraw all of the cash that you have in the bank to purchase anything that you want? Well, I will not be surprised, because when they came into government and we had over 200 million reserve, that was wiped out in no time. So I can well understand. There used to be, Mr. Speaker, there used to be a sinking fund during the time that Sir John ran government. There used to be a sinking fund. So every time the government took a loan, the government would put a certain percentage of its revenue aside and good managers, and the ladies, the women, the mothers, the wives in this country, they understand what I'm saying. Single mothers, you name them. My mother never worked anywhere. But she would get money and she would go to town to shop on a Saturday. Because I didn't go to church in those days. Yes, that's when I was growing up as a child. She didn't work. But when somebody was broke, they could always go to her, and there was always a little savings somewhere. And that is how women are able to manage the resources that they have. Some of us men can be careless. We can just spend. We can just spend. Of course. So, Mr. Speaker, when this government came in again, we have now re-established a sinking fund. Because what we have been doing over the years is rolling over debt. And all we keep on paying is interest. We hardly ever touch the capital payments. So, Mr. Speaker, the establishment of this fund is not a new creation of this government. We didn't come and create the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. That was created when the act was passed in 2015. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is we are fixing what they did not do properly. Because in the rush to establish, they created a 5-line section for an economic fund. And need I ask, who was in charge of this fund? Because it says it was established. The St. Lucia National Economic Fund is established. Who established the fund? Where was the account opened? Who are the signatories on the account? Who was in charge? Today, we come to the Parliament of St. Lucia with proper legislation. But the member for Castries South will not understand proper legislation. And now if politicians were on it, they would have a problem. But because it doesn't have politicians on it, they now have a problem. So tell me, you do not trust a fund that is established as the National Economic Fund with the following persons on it: the Director of Finance, who is the chairperson. So I want to ask the member for Vieux-Fort South. I want to ask the member for Vieux-Fort South, as his members on this side were alluding to, are we saying that the Minister of Finance can direct the PS of Finance or the Director of Finance to make expenses for government that does not go through the proper process or procedure? Because if, from what I gathered on this side, that the Minister of Finance can dictate to these people, we all who are in government knows that even if you tell a PS, who's the accounting officer, that this is what I want done, and they tell you that is not in keeping with what the requirements of the legislation that governs what government should do, that they are not obligated. And they can ask the minister to give them a directive in writing. So, Mr. Speaker, to tell me that the Director of Finance, who is the chairperson of this board, then you have the Budget Director, you have the Chief Economist, you have one representative from Invest St. Lucia, a representative from the ministry responsible for commerce, a representative from the Attorney General's chambers, a representative from the private sector. So you are talking about prescribing the board with 7 people, but saying that it can range from 5 to 7. There is some discretion, because you can choose to appoint 7 persons. You can choose to appoint 5 persons. A decision would be made which 5, but it has to be one of the 5 has to be out of the 7 called here. And it cannot leave out the director of finance, because that's the chairperson already prescribed. Now, these are the persons who handle all of the major issues in terms of the finances of government. Now, Mr. Speaker, I heard the member for Castries South talking about the account not being in St. Lucia, the this, the that. It is not where the account is. It is who controls what is in the account. I know he has accounts that are not in St. Lucia. I know there are members there who have accounts that are not in St. Lucia. But who controls the money that's in the account? Who controls it? So it's not an issue of where you bank. It's an issue of who makes the decision on the use of the funds. And we have to understand the legislation that is before us. I mean, for a bill that was so simple, as indicated by the member for ancillary countries. Mr. Speaker, we had a problem. We have not been meeting our obligations under the CIP because of the shortfall of the legislation that was passed by the previous government. All we are doing is correcting something that needed to be corrected. But the problem with the members opposite is that they don't want the correction. So here's their focus. And here's what they are concerned about. The Minister of Finance shall lay before Parliament every financial year for its approval the purpose for which the funds will be allocated. So that seemed to be the section that they are concerned about. But it already says here, and on the capital projects, for the purpose of subsection 1A and B, the minister shall, after consultation with cabinet, by order published in the Gazette, declare government-approved capital project. So capital projects will not be approved in isolation of the public knowledge. And the copy of the Gazette comes to every member of the Parliament. Every member of the Parliament has access to the Gazette. You know, the leader of the opposition office doesn't get copies of the Gazette, then we need to correct that. Huh? But if it goes to the business, it goes then. If it needs to. So, Mr. Speaker, we cannot come to this honorable house when there is a deficiency. And you ask me if I have I have every confidence in the Attorney General that we have today presiding over the office of Attorney General in St. Lucia. I have worked with other Attorney Generals. And I can tell you, if there's one Attorney General who is meticulous, who checks everything, and it's not that nothing goes wrong, there are possibilities that things will slip by. But sometimes I tell the Attorney General, I think he's overcautious about things. But he said, I have to give my government good legal advice. Unlike the other side. When the Attorney General gave them advice, they didn't take it. When they tell them, you don't have no case in that, don't worry about that, that cannot go anywhere, they didn't listen. They didn't listen. They took the matter to court. When the Attorney General wrote them opinions, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite hire people and they don't have confidence in the people that they hire. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite, that is what they do, Mr. Speaker. That is how they operate. So when they see good legislation now coming to the House, legislation that affords us the protection that we need, so that when an investor comes to St. Lucia and he invests in CIP, he can know that there is proper legislation in place for the establishment of an account. I didn't have a member for Castries South. I want to ask the member for Castries South, where is the account that was established for CIP? And Mr. Speaker, if he is willing to answer me, I'm willing to sit down and allow him to answer me. Because their legislation said the St. Lucia National Economic Fund is established.
Sit down, you want to answer? You want me to answer?
Yes.
You ask me. Mr. Speaker, the honorable
Through you,
member...
Mr. Speaker.
Oh, sorry.
Honorable members, that's not how it works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, the members must stop playing these games with the business of the country. Mr. Speaker, if the members on the other side were genuine about this, you know what they would have said? There was a deficiency in the legislation that we passed. We are satisfied that you are strengthening the legislation, but we think that if you want to strengthen the legislation, if you add this to it or you add that to it, that can make it even stronger. I would have given, but to give the impression that a little bill of 5 pages, that, oh, we're trying to rush through legislation at one sitting of the House. Mr. Speaker, you know how many times I've been in this House when legislation has been presented the morning when you enter, the other papers were changed. And when I say I never got the document, the member for Beaufort South tell me, if it's any comfort to you, I didn't get mine either. But he's the one passing the bill, you know. But you see, Mr. Speaker, these things happen. That's not the first time we come into Parliament and legislation. We asking for suspension of subsection 48.2. Maybe that might be the easiest thing to remember, to allow legislation to go through its remaining stages. But members will try and say, oh, this is a big bill. You passing this public consultation. Where was the public consultation on this one to establish the St. Lucia Economic Fund that you spoke about? When I asked for it as a parliamentarian, I asked, where's the legislation? I was told it will come, but we're passing the bill now. The CIP Act, you forget I was there, you wasn't there. You see, Mr. Speaker, we asked for the accompanying legislation, the regulations to govern this. And today, all we have done, Mr. Speaker, and as I compliment the Attorney General's chambers for strengthening the legislation, for giving clear guidelines that will govern the operations and who is in charge. There's no ambiguity to this legislation. It specifies the things that needs to be specified. It doesn't just say the fund is established and qualifying investments of cash shall be paid into the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. That's all the legislation. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think honorable members on the other side of the House should vote overwhelmingly with this side of the House for fixing the legislation and strengthening the level of accountability that must be given on the National Economic Fund through the CIP. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Library.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, despite members opposite's best attempts to try to sugarcoat what is happening here, the arguments advanced by this side of the House are logical and cogent arguments, Mr. Speaker. And I think members opposite should learn to take a bit of advice when it is in the best interest of the country. And as I listen to the debate in this House, Mr. Speaker, it's just a reminder of the destructive nature of the United Workers' Party in office. They found the DSH proposal, they rushed to sign it, putting our country in a serious holding pattern. They found the HIA redevelopment with the World Bank. They went and they destroyed it. The Labour Party set in motion the CIP so that we can create the fiscal space to deal with the social and economic challenges of the country. They have decided to launch an attack on it. Mr. Speaker, clearly, this bill is a backdoor attempt to cover up the government's failure to comply with Section 33 of the CIP Act over the last 3 years. Because over the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker, if the Labour Party was in office, we would have utilized those monies to give St. Lucians access to quality health care. We would support things like the laptop program, skills development, invest in the productive sectors of the economy, Mr. Speaker. And earlier, you know, in the attempts to make us look bad, the member for Caspi Southeast, and he's laughing, he said that when they came into office, no Coast Guard boats were working. Mr. Speaker, had we been in office, we would have fixed up the boats. Because when they came into office, all except 2 boats, except 2, were in operation. Today, the Defender is not working. It was only PO3 and PO6 that wasn't working when they came into office. Now PO4 is not working. The Defender is not working. So you have 4 that's not working. But you'll have CIP monies to do all kinds of things. But you know, you stood up there trying to blame this side of the House for having all boats out of commission. You all came in, you all found 2 boats not working. Now it's 4. And I repeat, PO3 and PO4. And now the Defender. Yes, you said that, the Coast Guard. You said that when you were speaking under the HIA redevelopment. Yes, you did. Go to government Hansard. But you see, Mr. Speaker, the point is this. How much money has been collected in the fund to date and will be transferred to this new and costly entity, which is completely unnecessary? I think it has been clearly established on this side of the House that when you come here and you remove oversight of Parliament, you remove the oversight of Parliament, you usurp the authority of Parliament to have a cabinet and designated appointees to deal with the fund. That was not the idea. When the fund was conceived and established, that was not the idea. You have an independent auditor, remunerated board members, when all you had to do was to set up an account under the control of the Accountant General, which could have been audited by the Director of Audit, as has been clearly established here, at no extra cost, Mr. Speaker. This government is notorious for complicating simple things. And they are trying to attack us on this side of the House for being what we are not. In terms of prudent management of the economy, we are superior to this government. In terms of fiscal discipline, we are superior to this government. In terms of good governance, Mr. Speaker, we place tremendous emphasis on good governance. And definitely, without a doubt, what is coming from members opposite is that Saki fet fet, mopa mele. We warn them about the borrowing, and they're on a road of their own. And they laugh because the country is of no consequence to them. The parents who cannot afford to send their children to school, they have no consequence to them. The people they fired in the NICE program, they don't care. So there's no hospital in the South because they don't need it. Look at them. They don't need the hospital. But we do. So they'll take the cool time and do whatever they want. They can fly to Miami, they can go to Martinique, they can go all over the place. So they can laugh at very serious things. But one thing I can say to you, for the past 3 years, you all have demonstrated very clearly that you don't care. We cannot make you care. But you are going to pay at the polls for oppressing the people of this country. You know, sometimes people can come day in, day out and blame this opposition for this and blame this opposition for that. We live in a democracy. And last time the people were not satisfied, they decided to vote for them, so that they could make all the things that they said they were going to make right. But all the things that they have messed up are things they found. They found HIA redevelopment intact with the World Bank, destroyed it. Just give them anything that's good and they destroy it. The country was actually on a growth path. They are trying to destroy it. The CIP has been adulterated. They have bought there and they have this there. Over the past 3 years, begging them to do the right thing. Where the CIP is concerned, they are not doing it. And they come with some backdoor thing. Some backdoor approach to cover up.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, Mr. Speaker, can we get back to the debate on the bill? The honorable member.
Man, sit down.
Honorable member of the library. No.
The man is interrupting. I'm speaking on the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member of the library.
It's not the man, it's the member.
Mr. Speaker, he's just glossing over, talking about a whole ton of issues, and there's a lot of
Honorable
latitude.
member Councillor Canris, I'll handle that.
Thank you.
You may proceed, honorable member of the library.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you in charge of this chamber. And you know what? If I am deviating from the standing orders, or if I'm trying to impute improper motives, I can understand interruptions. But just, you know, for fun, people engage in serious business, and for fun, the member for Canris Ancillary would just get a point of order to disturb my presentation. Mr. Speaker, this is completely unacceptable.
Yes,
And I've seen over time the abuse.
And I have ruled on that.
No,
so
but
let's move
every time, Mr. Speaker, and I have cautioned the member for Ancillary Canris before. I have cautioned him before.
Honorable,
understand?
now you really
No, Mr.
strain
Speaker.
and you've
Mr.
moved away
Speaker.
from the subject before
Sir.
this house. Now let's get back on track
Mr.
and let's
Speaker,
proceed.
est-ce nom ka parlant kay konsit? Moun ki pa intéressé en affaires pays a, ex affaires Saint-Clicien, si yo pa vle tan sa magadia, then yo ka aller à l'autre côté. But when I'm addressing serious business in this house, I do not appreciate interruptions. When the people of my constituency are without a hospital while they're having their fun, I cannot be laughing with them. When the Carter Road, which was supposed to have been built by now, was in a deplorable condition where the ambulance can go and pick up this lady right up Carter. You know, and they have money doing all kind of pappy show with permanent do and all kind of lockerbie. And you expect me to come here and be in a good mood when we're speaking about constructive things, dealing with the business of the people of this country, and for people to believe that they can just stand on a point of order when there's no point of order?
Honorable Member Library, get back to the subject matter.
Normal navigation.
But that's the subject matter, you know, Mr. Speaker. What we were going to utilize the economic fund for. That's what it is. That's what it is.
Allow him to resume normal navigation, please.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Library must be heard in silence. He's not disturbing me. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the member for ancillary canneries, instead of interrupting my presentation, you know what he should have been saying when he stood up to make his presentation? That consistent with new trends in tourism and well documented in publications of the World Bank, and I quote, "The emerging market niches can help deepen impact of tourism on the local economy. The new business model for competitive tourism involves managing the customer experience. The entire destination has become the tourism plant. As such, the management of tourism needs to embrace a host of new areas such as environmental protection and solid waste management, land use planning to ensure the maintenance of scenic views, policies to protect and showcase culture and heritage," unquote. That is what he's supposed to be doing. Say, listen, instead of just depending on hotels, big hotels alone, let us develop our country. But you see, only those who have love for this country would think of those things. You see, I was born in this country, cooked and baked in this culture. And when people are having fun, Mr. Speaker, I know how we have to interact with our constituents, where they are without the basic amenities. And they come there and they laugh. But it's okay. The laughing will come to an end at some point, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am joining my colleagues in questioning the validity of this bill. The concerns raised, I believe the Prime Minister should take note and try to address it in a very serious way. In the spirit it was intended. We communicated in a very sincere fashion, and I believe that the Prime Minister, along with the AG, should take a fresh look at the bill and offer some level of solution to how we can move forward with it. And as the member for Castries South indicated, there is no doubt in our minds that as soon as we get back into office, we are going to review this piece of legislation. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a hot show, eh?
Member Viewfort Library, can you turn on the off? Member for Library. Member for Viewfort South.
Mr. Speaker, my comments will be brief after the very incisive analysis of the bill by the member for Castries South. However, Mr. Speaker, I want to preface these comments by a general observation regarding the treatment of legislation. Mr. Speaker, there is a creeping tendency in this House that when members speak to the content of legislation, issues with legislation, that somehow an impression is being conveyed that they have some agenda against the Attorney General's department or the drafting personnel in the Attorney General's department. Of course, there's a particular way the member for Castries Southeast puts it. He says, well, they're the same people who drafted 4 members when they were in government, and now we are finding problems with them. Mr. Speaker, I really do think that the House should make a judgment of when sincere objections are being raised about legislation before the House. And if the opposition is making a contribution by identifying weaknesses and problems with the legislation, it is not that in the vast majority of cases, members of the opposition want the government to withdraw their bill, only that the bill be cleaned up, perfected, tidied up. Because at the end of the day, when it reaches our statute books, the House as a whole is held responsible for the legislation. I have been the subject of all kinds of commentary when I make suggestions regarding legislation. I even recall, Mr. Speaker, on the occasion that we were debating the Castries constituency bill, a bill which reeked with problems, and we will begin to discover the full extent of the problems as the bill is implemented, and already we are seeing signs of what's going to happen. But I recall that there was a provision in that bill which spoke of common law powers of police officers. And you're a former magistrate. I pointed out that we have always had a criminal code from 1914, 1916. And there's no such thing as common law powers of police officers. And persons found that objectionable to point out that this is wrong. You can't put something like that in legislation. And what has happened? It has reached our statute books. And so a country like ours that is a codal jurisdiction, with a criminal code, we have the extraordinary provision that speaks of common law powers of police officers. That's the kind of issues that we have. When very simply, we could have corrected the legislation in its passage, particularly at the committee stage. Some bills, Mr. Speaker, can be rescued. Some bills need sometimes to be withdrawn and rethought. And really the test of doing that is simple. Is the bill so flawed that on reaching committee stage, it cannot be remedied by a series of amendments to the bill? I think what members on this side are trying to say to the government, this bill is too flawed. You can keep your concept, your idea, which of course I shall come to in a few minutes, but that it requires some revision. But we treat it as a one-upmanship, that if the government says, all right, I'm going to rethink, then it's a victory for the opposition, and Lord forbid, it's a victory for Kenny Anthony in particular. But I'm not the lead spokesman on the bill. The member for Castries South is. But that's a tragedy of this. It's unnecessary. Now, Mr. Speaker, that having been said, I want to focus on a few points pertaining to this bill. Much ado has been made about the fact that in Section 33 of the existing legislation, the section dealing with the establishment of the St. Lucia National Economic Fund was very brief. In fact, it was scoffed at, it was laughed at, etc. And the member for Castries Southeast is fond of reminding us that when he sat on the opposition benches, he sometimes drew attention to legislation, was told, well, we can go ahead and pass such legislation and adjustments will be made. And I think the merit of the advice, even in his own thinking, has value, because today in this House we have a classic example, the Adoption Act. Passed just a few weeks ago, we now have to come back to this House and introduce a series of amendments. Now, what are you going to do? Go and blame the Attorney General's office or blame the minister? These things happen. They're inevitable. And I am going to go even further and say that that legislation we pass, even though you're amending it in this sitting of the House, you're going to come back again in the weeks ahead and make further amendments to it because of its imperfections. And what? We on this side should gloat about that? It's a normal incident of the passage of legislation. Now, yes, Mr. Speaker, Section 33 was brief. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not justification for introducing this bill. That can never be the justification for it. What the government has objected to and opposed is the fact that projects had to be brought to the House to be debated. The Minister of Finance was required to present proposals to the House, and it is the House that had to decide whether these proposals will proceed to funding. You know, Mr. Speaker, life has some curious ironies. Sometimes it's impossible to understand things with the clarity they need to be understood. But those of us who are privy to the creation of the legislation, the drafting of the legislation, who saw the legislation in formation, who understand the background of the legislation, sometimes could give good testimony. Why did we adopt this approach that the House must approve the expenditure? In actual fact, it was meant to reflect the very openness and transparency that is being championed. Because even though this legislation may have had imperfections, the then government was very clear that no matter how difficult and hard it was, we needed to create some kind of partnership with the opposition on the CIP. Because in its creation, we ensured that the opposition was represented on the committee that led to the decision to accept the CIP. And I have never, ever denied the fact that I have said that I have profound anxieties, and for me, it was a journey to accept the CIP. But that is a matter that I would deal with in my own way at the appropriate time. And when the government enacted Section 33, and what is surprising is this, everybody believes that that is the only section that speaks to the Lucia National Economic Fund. We made it very clear that we had to put flesh on the bones of the legislation, and for that reason, we created a Section 40 with elaborate powers to enact regulations. You could have corrected whatever defects you think you had by simply enacting legislations because you were empowered to do so. But look at what Section 40, subsection B says. Without prejudice to the generality of subsection 1, the minister may make regulations in respect of the requirements for a St. Lucia National Economic Fund investment. No mention is made of this, Mr. Speaker, in this debate today. Everybody's making fun about 5 or 6 lines in Section 33. But the intention was clear. Very, very clear. And the former government, in its wisdom, recognized that the process of implementing the CIP would have taken time. And therefore, what you needed to do was to create enabling powers. So this could have been done by regulation. And if that is the case, then you understand the depth of the problem in coming with a different kind of legislation, conceptually different. The intention was to get away from Parliament, from a debate on Parliament. The opposition is too troublesome, especially over CIP. That was never necessary because you had the empowering means to do so. Mr. Speaker, there are really some other troubling aspects of this bill, and I'm going to touch a couple of them very briefly. Let's go back, Mr. Speaker, to clause 4, functions of the fund. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to come back on this matter of the government of St. Lucia becoming a loan agency. Come back to that. But I want to focus very briefly on clause 4(1)(e). It says the functions of the fund are, and look at E, to provide monies for a purpose approved by Cabinet that is not considered recurrent in nature. Now, what is this animal? What is this animal, this project that is not recurrent in nature, but it is not a capital project? What is it really? What amorphous animal is this? What amorphous entity is this? But there's a greater problem, Mr. Speaker. I know you have heard this before from me ad nauseum. Doesn't matter. These things will eventually get contested in different fora. The concept of to provide monies for a purpose approved by Cabinet, you proceed to establish in clause 4(1)(a), B, C, and D purposes to be financed, to advance loans to the government, to provide investment for government-approved capital project, to reduce government debt, to purchase government bonds. And you're not satisfied that you have covered everything, then you introduce an E to provide monies for a purpose approved by Cabinet. Why bother with the other subsections? Why bother with the other subsections? And you would know, Mr. Speaker, that uncertainty is fatal to law. That is why we keep on raising it with members of the government to give more specificity to what it is that they really have in mind. How can you then blame us and make us feel that we are causing so much injury to you, causing you so much harm, causing you to make you feel that we believe that we are the only ones who know what to do and how to do it? That's not the point. We are simply making these suggestions to persuade you to make the adjustments to improve your legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you just bear with me again. Look at this. Let's go back to one that has been talked about. Look at clause 6, Mr. Speaker. The board consists of not less than 5 members and no more than 7 members to be appointed by the Cabinet as follows. I have heard the explanation offered by the member from Castries Southeast. And I know, to use language that you'll understand, the member for Castries Southeast is the de facto legal representative of the government of St. Lucia in the House. I mean, he is the authority on legal matters. Yes, he's got a promotion, I tell you, because if you notice that he goes through the corridors to discuss with the AG the legislation, what changes must be made, how he's going to reason, how you must say what, etc., etc. And of course, you know, Mr. Speaker, what he has said in relation to the opposition and myself personally about our legal trading, but leave that for the time being. So he has given an interpretation of what this means. If the member for Castries Southeast is correct, why on earth didn't the drafting department say exactly what he said? Why enact legislation with such ambiguity? But what baffles me, when you then go to clause 11, remuneration, Cabinet shall, on the recommendation of the minister, determine the remuneration to be paid to the members of the board. Of the 7 members, 6 are civil servants. Why is remuneration being paid to civil servants who might be performing those functions in the course of their normal duties? Why are we creating that kind of precedent? Why we have added on to their duties by putting them on these boards, and then on top of that, when they are meeting to make decisions about a business or government, you're going to pay them? There's only one private sector person on that board. Not that I know of. Certainly, when we're in office, we discourage it. Should not happen. Should not happen. Should not happen. Not when they're performing their duties in a normal course of their employment. Well, customs are a different issue. Different issue. You're dealing with practice conventions where they are concerned. But this is madness. Now, Mr. Speaker, my deepest concern is a conceptual one. We are transforming the government of St. Lucia into a lending agency.
I think it's in performing the same duties.
The government of St. Lucia has now become a loan agency. Because when, Mr. Speaker, you look at clause 6.4, the board shall manage the monies and business of the fund, consider and approve an application for a loan or an investment in a government-approved capital project, ensure that a loan is used for the purpose for which it was granted, ensure the repayment of a loan at the time it is due, ensure that the proceeds of the loan are applied to the government-approved capital project, establish and maintain, the favorite one of the member for Castries Southeast, establish and maintain a sinking fund. Now, Mr. Speaker, why would the government in this day and age become or transform itself into a lender? Make decisions about granting loans to developers. You know, Mr. Speaker, this one baffles me. Why would the government put itself into a position where itself or the persons employed by it can become under serious pressure, duress over applications for loans? And Mr. Speaker, the opposition is raising a serious issue, albeit the member for Castries Southeast. If you look at clauses 12, subclause 4, and clause 13, subclause 4, the word credentials is used. So you can refuse a loan if you're not satisfied about credentials. Now, Mr. Speaker, for goodness sake, you're a lawyer. Well, you've been in private practice. You've been a magistrate. What on earth does credentials mean? Does it mean financial competence alone? Does it mean moral probity? Does it mean support? Well, it could also mean political affiliation. That is why you cannot leave a term like that at large. All that you needed to do was to define the term credentials in clause 2 and say that by credentials it is meant financial ability to invest, financial probity, blah, 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 and make it clear as you have drafted, it leaves it at large. That is what the member for Castries South was trying to say, you know. That this is loose, it's going to put you in trouble. Clean it up. But Mr. Speaker, I think it's sad that we have stripped Parliament of some measure of partnership and accountability. You seem to have a passion for parliamentary reform. And you know, one of the worst provisions, I think, most abused provisions in our legislation is contained in Clause 19. The Cabinet and the government has decided that Parliament will not be involved in making decisions about how we're going to deploy CIP money. Rather, what is going to happen is a report will be laid. Every single person in this house knows that that is the easy way out. Because, unfortunately, we have never ever developed a mechanism to examine, to consider, to debate reports that are laid in Parliament. We made a very timid start with the last government when we had a parastatal unit, and reports, statements of accounts were sent to that unit for evaluation, and the intention was eventually to amend our rules to allow opportunities to debate whatever is laid in Parliament, particularly the accounts of statutory bodies. So we all know full well that once you see a report is going to be laid, that's it, matter closed. Of course, Mr. Speaker, you're welcome to make reference to it in debates, in speeches, in commentary, because it's now part of the official record of the House, part of Hansard. But the nitty-gritty of going in to discuss and debate the fundamentals, we don't do. And that is rather unfortunate. So, Mr. Speaker, I join my colleagues. I can't support this bill. It doesn't matter, I guess, at the end of the day. But this is defective legislation. And the government can do a better job at achieving their objectives in this legislation if they sit back, listen to these comments, and then make adjustments before we proceed to the third stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Worst bill, departure of governance, inadequate for Parliament, escrow funds. You know, Mr. Speaker, the disappointing part of these debates is the consistency of the members of the other side. I cannot recall ever coming to this House in which they actually applauded our side for doing anything correct, despite the fact that the evidence of the results of what we've been doing show that there are things that we're doing that are correct. I came to the House, Mr. Speaker, on more than one occasion and indicated the inadequacy of what had been drafted in the Act, particularly as it pertained to the Economic Fund. And I indicated to members that we were recognizing that we weren't following the rules 100%, but that we believed that we were at least fulfilling the spirit of what was being required. I indicated that the CIP projects that we were doing and where we were spending the money was in the estimates. I was told That's not true. In fact, several members on the other side again repeated that again today, that we've not done that. There's nothing there, that we've not shown where it is. I've indicated it's there. I came and I showed the numbers. The member from Castries South again is asking where.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
I'm going to give it to you now. You sit down. I'm going to give it to you.
Mr.
You're
Speaker,
embarrassing yourself enough. Sit down.
I'm embarrassed.
Honorable members, let's not cross. Let's not cross. But he's standing on the point of
Can
order,
you
Mr.
now
Prime
sit down?
Minister.
Can you now sit down?
Honorable members.
Because I am standing on a point of
Honorable
order.
members.
That's total
Honorable Prime
disrespect.
Minister is indicating he's standing on a point of order. Please.
You see, now that you sit down, I will sit down.
Boy, you know, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, we must not take this house for a joke.
You can imagine, you know, when people...
Mr. Prime Minister, let me make a point at first, Mr. Prime Minister. This house is not a jokey business, yeah. According to the sound, this is not a little Papa Obiaman thing we're dealing with, you know. Honorable Leader Castro, that's it. This is serious people's business. We have St. Lucia and in the international world watching us right now. So let's get our act back. We started well, let's continue and end on the proper note. You may continue, Mr. Prime Minister.
May I make this a document in the House? While we're talking, you know, Mr. Speaker, I sat quietly, listened to what the members had to say, continuously misleading the House, continually lying, continuing exaggerating what the truths are. So again, you know, all one
Honorable
has
Prime
to do,
Minister,
member,
we may
is to
get
go-
our attention, but please do not use, there's some words we are not, parliamentary language does not allow us or we should not be calling members liars in this honorable House.
the misleading the House. So I have with me the estimates of the revenue of the expenditure 2019-2020. I would assume, Mr. Speaker, that they would be familiar with this book and that this book has already been made a document to the House. And that the experts over there, particularly given that there are some members who've been there for 20 years, 5 terms, on page 595, on the estimates, project expenditures, summary project financing, source of funds, CIP revenue 470000, local contribution $34 million. I've taken the liberty of actually putting a document for you that actually shows you where the $34 million is and by page. And so therefore, it's certainly not something I could have come after the fact and manifested. That this has been there all the time.
Speaker, a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the estimates would indicate, the Prime Minister is misleading the House. Mr. Speaker, the estimates would indicate the project. It would identify the source of funds, whether it's from the Kuwaiti Fund, from JICA, or wherever, Mr. Speaker. To suggest to us that in the estimates you have, the project actually have a source of funds, CIP, is not true, Mr. Speaker. You may wish, if you had submitted that to the House and asked for its approval, you would have been following the legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, this is misleading the House and it's deliberate. And that's what I was on the point of order, and I was hoping he would not go down that road. It's unlawful too, because the estimates identify the project. It says the source of fund, Kuwaiti Fund, OPEC Fund, JICA. There's none that says CIP. If not,
Mr. Speaker, again, you know, it's really farcical to actually see members on the other side coming up with that kind of excuse. It really bothers me that they have members here who profess to be economists and understand the financing. I've said it to you, right here on page 595, in plain English, it says, source of funds, CIP revenue, Code 47000, local contribution, $34 million. I have provided to you the list here of each page, and when you go to each page, you will see code 4771000, which indicates the source of funds is CIP.
That's source of revenue.
Miss, you know, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, this is the problem, you know, is when members on the other side, right, cannot even substantiate their own lies and mislead them. Just like when the member came.
Mr. Brown, Mr.
Lies.
Prime Minister. Mr. Prime Minister. We are not supposed to, I'm not going to repeat it again. We are not supposed to. It is unparliamentary to call members, refer to any member as a liar, and to say a member has spoken lies is to call him a liar. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Prime Minister, please to withdraw that statement and to refrain from doing it.
Mr. Speaker, I refuse to withdraw that statement.
Mr. Prime Minister, no.
And let me explain to
Mr.
you
Prime
why,
Minister.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Prime
Because
Minister.
far worse has been said in this House.
Mr. Prime Minister.
The member from
Mr.
Cassidy
Prime Minister,
South
no.
stood up and
Mr.
said
Prime
right
Minister.
there in front of us, right, that we were misleading the House. And said
Honorable
it was
Prime Minister.
impossible.
Honorable Prime Minister. Honorable Prime Minister. You cannot stand and say you're not going to withdraw a statement.
I'm not going to withdraw it. So you're going to have to take whatever action you want. But I'm not withdrawing it.
Honorable Prime Minister, I'm going to ask you please to withdraw the statement.
I'm not.
Then, sir, I will put the question to the House.
Please.
Very well. Honorable
The Speaker has been doing that all day now. The people on the other side.
Honorable
shooting
members.
Down the back of St. Lucia, made all kinds of nasty remarks. And there was no comment, and now on a simple thing like a lie. No, sir.
Honorable members, the question is that the St. Lucia National Economic Fund Bill be read a second time. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye.
Aye.
As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to establish the St. Lucia National Economic Fund and for related matters.
Since when you're so concerned about my speaker? Absolutely. Concerned about something different here.
Honorable members, clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Part 1, clauses 3 to 11.
St. Lucia National Economic Fund.
Part 1, clauses 3 to 11 stands part of the bill. Part 2, clauses 12 to 13.
Loans and investments.
Part 2, clauses 12 to 13 stands part of the bill. Part 3, clauses 14 to 19.
Finance.
Part 3, clauses 14 to 19 stands part of the bill. Part 4, clauses 20 to 21.
Miscellaneous.
Part 4, clauses 20 to 21 stands part of the bill. Clause 1,
Short title.
clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as of the contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the St. Lucia National Economic Fund Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee be adopted and the bill be read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the St. Lucia National Economic Fund Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This Act may be cited as the St. Lucia National Economic Fund Act 2019.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters.
Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order 48-2 to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Prime Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Proceed, Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present a second reading of a bill shortly entitled Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters. The bill for consideration is the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters. The purpose of the bill is to give effect to and provide for the implementation of the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters. Clauses 1 and 2 of the bill provide for a short title and interpretation. Clause 3 of the bill gives the treaty the force of law. Under Clause 4 of the bill, the minister responsible for the Caribbean Community Affairs may designate a central authority that has the responsibility and power to execute requests for legal assistance. The minister responsible for Caribbean Community Affairs is given the power under Clause 5 of the bill to make amendments to the schedule to the bill. Clause 6 of the bill gives the minister responsible for Caribbean Community Affairs the power to make regulations to give effect to the bill. The schedule of the bill contains the text of the treaty. In July of 2005, Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia signed the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters. The treaty was also signed by the 12 other member states of the Caribbean community. As a result of being a party to the treaty, state parties will give each other, to the extent possible under their laws, the widest measure of mutual legal assistance at any stage of an investigation, prosecution, and judicial proceedings in relation to serious crimes. The treaty consists of 30 articles. Under Article 1 of the treaty, certain terms used in the treaty are defended, such as serious crime, which means an act or omission under the laws of the state party, which constitutes a criminal offense punishable by at least 12 months imprisonment or more, and includes an offense against the law relating to taxation. Under Article 2 of the treaty, the purpose of the treaty is to increase cooperation and in mutual legal assistance amongst Caribbean countries with respect of serious criminal matters and to combat criminal activity. The treaty provides a definition for mutual legal assistance to include A, identifying and locating persons and objects, taking evidence or statements from persons, obtaining the production of judicial or other documents, serving judicial documents, examining objects, sites, and premises, providing any available information and relevant exhibits, providing originals or certified copies of any document and records, facilitating the personal appearance of witnesses, effecting a temporary transfer of persons in custody to appear as witnesses, tracing, seizing, freezing, and confiscating the proceeds or instrumentalities of crime, and providing other assistance consistent with the objectives of the treaty. Under Article 3 of the treaty, each state party must take the necessary steps to ensure effective implementation of the object and purpose of the treaty within its territory, and this includes the designation of a central authority that is responsible to execute requests for legal assistance and to transmit those requests to the competent authorities for execution. By virtue of Article 5 of the treaty, a request for assistance must be made in writing. However, in urgent circumstances, a request must be made orally, but must be confirmed in writing within 7 days of the oral request. The request must include certain information, including the name of the competent authority conducting the proceedings to which the request relates, the purpose of the request, and a description of the assistance required, a description of the facts alleged to constitute the offense, and copies of the text of relevant laws, the identity, nationality, and address of the person to be served, and specifications of any time limit within which compliance with the request is required. A request for assistance is required to be executed as expeditiously and practicably as possible as required under Article 6 of the treaty. According to Article 7 of the treaty, a request for assistance may be refused if the request would be contrary to the laws of the requested state or unreasonable on other grounds. For example, the request relates to an offense for which the requested person has been convicted or acquitted. However, where assistance is provided, the requesting state shall not disclose or use information or evidence obtained for purposes other than these stated in the request without prior consent of the central authority of the requested state. Article 10 of the treaty provides that the cost of executing the request is borne by the requesting state unless the parties otherwise determine. These costs may include travel and other expenses related to the transportation of persons, including an accompanying officials to and from the territory of the requested state. Under Article 11 of the treaty, a request may be made for assistance in identifying or locating persons and objects believed to be within the territory of the requested state. However, this request must indicate in writing the purpose of seeking that assistance or cooperation. The treaty also makes provision for other matters, such as the service of documents, assistance in gathering evidence, the transfer of persons in custody to give the evidence or to assist in investigations, search and seizure proceedings of crimes and disposal of assets, and the settlement of disputes.
Honorable members, the question is that the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Crime Matters bill be read a second time. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to give effect to and provide for the implementation of the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters.
Honorable members, Clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 3.
Force of law.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill.
Aye.
Clause 4.
Designation of central authority.
Clause 4 stands part of the bill. Clause 5.
Amendment or schedule.
Clause 5 stands part of the bill. Clause 6.
Regulations.
Clause 6 stands part of the bill. Schedule.
Section 2, Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters.
Schedule stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee be adopted and the bill read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters bill be read a third time and passed. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters Act 2019.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Public Health Amendment.
Public Health Amendment.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order 48-2 to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order number 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Prime Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Proceed, Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present for a second reading of a bill shortly entitled the Public Health Amendment. The bill for consideration is the Public Health Amendment Bill. The purpose of the bill is to amend the Public Health Act, Cap 1101. Clauses 1 and 2 of the bill provide for the short title and interpretation, respectively. Clause 3 of the bill amends Section 2 of the Act to delete the definition of the words public health inspector and to insert definitions for the words environmental health officer and public health hazard and public officer. A new Section 2A is included in the Act by Clause 4 of the bill to ensure that the obligations under the Act extend to and bind the Crown. Clauses 6 of the bill amend Section 5 of the Act to enable members of the Public Health Board to be remunerated for their services and to authorize to publish in the Gazette the names of persons who have been appointed as members of the board. Sections 7 and 8 of the Act are amended in clauses 7 and 8 of the bill, respectively, to substitute the term environmental health officer for the term public health inspector. Clause 9 of the bill amends Section 9 of the Act to stipulate additional regulations to be made by the minister. Section 11 of the Act is amended in Clause 10 of the bill to give officers powers including the ability to request information, seize or take samples of substances, and take photographs and videotapes when they have entered premises. Clause 11 of the bill amends Section 15 of the Act to increase the penalties to be imposed for contravention of the Act from $250 to $50,000 and from $25 to $500, and to increase the term of imprisonment from 3 months to 6 years. Clause 12 of the bill amends the Act to insert new provisions relating to the use of force to authorize the minister to amend the schedule of the Act by order to be published in the Gazette. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Public Health Amendment Bill is to amend the Public Health Act to make minor amendments for consistency with existing practices. When we had the recent incident, Mr. Speaker, with the free winds that was here, some of the weaknesses in our legislation were identified. And as a result of that, we chose to immediately come to the House to make amendments to strengthen the Act. Some definitions used in the Act are being changed and new definitions are added to the Act. Consequently, the term public health inspector is substituted with the term environmental health officer, which is currently used in the Ministry of Health. In keeping with the new technology, several sections of the Act are amended to revert to the use of environmental health officer. A definition is added to the Act for public health hazard, as this is the more modernized term used to describe various forms of threats to the public health. The definition of public officer that is used in the Constitution of the St. Lucia is also adopted for the purposes of the Act. A new provision is added to the Act to ensure that all government ministries and departments must comply with the provisions of the Act. Therefore, the Act binds the Crown. The Act is amended to clarify that one of the functions of the Minister of Health is to prevent, treat, limit, and suppress diseases of public health hazard through the conduct of, for example, investigations and inquiries to determine if there is a risk to human health. In terms of the Public Health Board that is established under the Act, the bill provides for the payment of remuneration, fees, or allowances to the board, and for the publication of the names of the members of the board as the first constituted and whenever there is a change in the membership of the board. Although the Act currently provides the Minister of Health with the ability to make regulations, the Act is amended for the making of regulations for a beauty and wellness center, a spa, a massage parlor, and a body art facility. Regulations may also be made by the Minister as a result of the amendment for the control and destruction of mosquitoes and other insects, rodents, and other vectors capable of transmitting or causing disease or a public health hazard. For the prevention and the control of public health hazard and in relation to a vaccination and inoculation, air and soil pollution, the collection and publication of epidemiology and other data pertaining to public health and occupational disease and employment health hazard, and fees in respect of an examination, a certificate, a license, or other matters under the Act. The amendment also permits the Minister to make regulations to prohibit or restrict smoke from tobacco and tobacco products, and to prohibit the sale of tobacco and tobacco products to and by minors in and around certain facilities. A power of entry is presently provided to the Chief Medical Officer, a medical officer of the health, and the Minister or a person authorized under the Act. This power is strengthened as the Act is amended to enable these persons to request substances for testing or analysis, to see size and take samples and request information and documents. In addition, officers may take photographs or videotapes of premises, bring machinery or on premises, and use machinery on the premises under specified conditions. The penalty imposed for various offenses under the Act have been increased. Result of the amendment to the Act. 2 new provisions are added to the Act. A use of force provision is inserted in the Act to enable and authorize persons to use force that is reasonably necessary to carry out the duties assigned to these persons under the Act. The other amendment allows for the Minister to amend the schedule, which contains the provisions relating to the Public Health Board, by an order published in the Gazette.
Honourable members, the question is that the Public Health Amendment Bill be read a second time. Honourable member for Castro Central.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the Public Health Amendment
bill as presented by the Honorable Prime Minister. I will be rather brief, Mr. Speaker, because I am aware of the late hour and the fact that we still have a number of pieces of legislation to go through. But I think it's really important to place in context this amendment in terms of what we are doing as a government for health overall. Mr. Speaker, you would have heard the Prime Minister spoke even earlier, and certainly we have been doing ever since we have come into office, highlighting and detailing the revolutionary changes we are making in the health sector in this country. Mr. Speaker, by the time this government concludes its term of office, the health sector will be a first-class health sector in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, from commissioning or partly commissioning the OKEU, we know that soon enough it will be fully commissioned, to the changes and improvements we are making at the community level in our wellness centers, in our community health centers, to the care we've taken to plan for the new St. Jude's, and the fact that we will soon have the sword-turning ceremony and we will complete St. Jude's by the end of our term of office, to the national health insurance that we are working on to ensure that not only will we have state-of-the-art facilities, but every St. Lucian will be able to access that health care, to the fact now that we have 24-hour dialysis happening, and the fact that we've increased the number of persons who can access dialysis, to the fact that we've increased the number of persons getting medical assistance as well. These changes in the Act are small but significant. It shows that our approach to health care, we regard health care not just as an absence of illness, but a complete state of wellness, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional health. Mr. Speaker, I recall when I was the Minister of Health at the Golden Hope Hospital, one of the changes we had made there was that we had raised quite a bit of money and we opened a spa there. Yes, we did. We had a well-functioning spa with manicures and pedicures and a hairdresser's station. At Golden Hope, we did that. We did that, state of the art. And what we did was that we had the patients scheduled to come to have their manicures, their pedicures, wash their hair. And that improved even their attitude to taking the medication. One of the things that goes very quickly when someone is suffering with mental illness, you see a deterioration in their personal hygiene. That is when something signals to you that someone isn't well. You see a deterioration in how they take care of themselves. So it is so important for a Public Health Act to recognize that facilities like spas and massage parlors and beauty centers are an integral and essential part of health. And I remember very, very clearly the minister, after I had left the government at the time, the minister who succeeded me as the Minister of Health immediately closed the spa at Golden Hope. He saw it as a waste of time. He closed it. We had actually gotten donations from the private sector. We had supplies to last for a whole year. Our hair dryers were donated. But then, not understanding the true concept of health, said it was a waste of time and closed it. And so what we are seeing now is an amendment to our Public Health Act recognizing the finer attributes of good health care which everybody is entitled to have. So I just want to say how very pleased I am to see that we are widening the remit and the sorts of activities that are recognized as essential to health, and in fact they can now be regulated by the Ministry of Health. I want to note also, Mr. Speaker, that under the definition of health, we are now looking at dealing with things like noise. I've got a serious problem in my constituency, and I've received letters and petitions and emails. I've had to have meetings with the Castries City Council and with the Housing Authority and with the police, because I have many complaints from my constituents about the level of noise within the city. Now, we all appreciate that if one lives in the city, one should expect to have more noise than usual. But the level of noise within the city and in some neighborhoods in St. Lucia is unacceptable, and it's causing a health problem for many of our citizens. And it is important that our health legislation, not just our public order legislation, but our health legislation, recognize that noise levels that are unacceptably high can cause serious health problems. So, Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to note that these amendments have been made to the Act, and that also the powers of the public health officers have been extended, that they can take equipment onto various premises, whether it be to measure noise levels, whether it be to take samples of whatever is happening there, so that we can enforce the legislation. I'm also very happy to see, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the places that tobacco can be sold. For example, whether it be sold near to a school or whatever. So that tells us that we are taking health very seriously. And I want to commend the government on this and to say that this is in keeping with the general thrust that our government is moving in terms of the health sector. So, Mr. Speaker, all that we would want to be sure of course, is that the resources are there to ensure that this legislation can be implemented. And that is why the National Health Insurance is so important. Because if we really have to have the standard of health that we need to have a self-financing system for healthcare, and this is what the government is also putting in place. So, Mr. Speaker, with this, I would like to lend my full support to the Public Health Amendment Act as presented by the Honourable Prime Minister.
Member for Castries North.
Mr. Speaker, just a short intervention, because I would love to be home now at 10:35, 10:40, thereabouts. But to say that I truly commend this piece of legislation and note the changes made to the original act, and to say that I hope that it's not just a change of name, but also a strengthening of the institution of public health and public education. Because many years ago, what we then was called the sanitary health inspectors was certainly a group of men and women who were well respected and the public feared. Because normally they would come and do the inspections and deal with all issues of potential dengue, rodents, etc. And if your environment was in a state unacceptable to those officers, you're likely to be charged, penalized, or otherwise arrested. That has gone out of the window.
We have lost a lot of the elements of public health, including public health engineering unit, which did a lot of cleaning of our ravines and parish drains and streams to ensure that all of the garbage was taken out and either burnt or taken to the landfill. And we've replaced it with things like stimulus and step, etc., which are actually seasonal but doesn't take care of the issue. And the fact that public health officers are not very effective, I am hoping that with the change, that the public health inspector will, one, be individuals with the teeth in the legislation, but also I believe government would now have to ensure that the infrastructure is put in place to have public health officers all over the country dealing with the environment, ensuring that our surroundings are clean and healthy, but also letting people know that you cannot violate the laws and get away with it. And that is why throughout the country, even when we introduce the caretaker program, which is done by the Ministry of Infrastructure, even then you see as we cut the grass, it's not just the grass behind the grass, but it's the garbage behind the grass that is left behind. And it just says something about the behavior of our people, the culture of our people, the practices of our people, the ability and the comfort that they take in just simply throwing things out of the window, as I experienced only yesterday driving down the Cassius-Gosley Highway, of just throwing bottles and stuff like that out of the window. So we need to ensure, and I appeal to the Prime Minister, Minister for Finance, to give support not only in the legislation, otherwise it will simply be on the books, but to give support with the personnel that will enforce the legislation. And there's another aspect of that which I hope we will reintroduce, what we used to call the police Zodi, litter wardens, sorry. But they were very, I mean, Mr. Speaker, they were very effective. And I always give this story of a gentleman who walked out, and you know, we had a minister who was very, he believed in PR, the late Lancico, Romanus Lancico. And here am I at outside a supermarket in Leclerc, and a gentleman walked out and opened whatever it was he was eating, and then he was about to dispose of it on the ground. And he looked around and he saw a garbage bin, and he said, "Lancico uvegelo." But it just shows the impact of public health education, the impact of PR, and that is important. The sensitization, sensitizing the people to let the people know the right, the things that they should do and not do. And I do hope that as we introduce this, with the powers that are enshrined in this legislation to the public health inspectors, that we can take it another level to assist us in cleaning up this country and maintaining the pristine green environment that we so often yearn to have, and we keep fighting as a government to bring about that level of beauty and maintenance of our environment. I thank you.
Honourable members, the question is that the Public Health Amendment Bill be read a second time. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to amend the Public Health Act, Cap 11.01, and for related matters.
Honourable members, Clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Clause 3.
Amendment of Section 2.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill. Clause 4.
Insertion of new Section 2A.
Clause 4 stands part of the bill. Clause 5.
Amendment of Section 4.
Clause 5 stands part of the bill. Clause 6.
Amendment of Section 5.
Clause 6 stands part of the bill. Clause 7.
Amendment of Section 7.
Clause 7 stands part of the bill. Clause 8.
Amendment of Section 8.
Clause 8 stands part of the bill. Clause 9.
Amendment of Section 9.
Clause 9 stands part of the bill. Clause 10.
Amendment of Section 11.
Clause 10 stands part of the bill. Clause 11.
Amendment of Section 15.
Clause 11 stands part of the bill. Clause 12.
Insertion of new sections 24 and 25.
Clause 12 stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that a committee rises and a bill be reported. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the Public Health Amendment Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee be adopted and the bill read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and the Public Health Amendment Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the Public Health Amendment Act 2019.
Honorable Member for Denry South.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move on behalf of the Minister of Education, Innovation, Gender Relations and Sustainable Development, the first reading of a bill shortly entitled Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Bill.
Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition.
Honorable Minister for Youth Development and Sports.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Standing Order 48-2 be suspended to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting. Yeah.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order number 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Proceed, Honorable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the second reading of a bill shortly entitled Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition Act. Mr. Speaker, very short bill, I might say. The purpose of the Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Bill, the bill is to provide new legislation to ban the importation, manufacturing, sale, use, and distribution of Styrofoam and plastic food service containers. Expanded polyurethane, which is more commonly referred to as Styrofoam, is a lightweight insulating plastic material used in food service containers. Single-use Styrofoam and plastic food containers are used by many food businesses in St. Lucia to provide food for customers. There are many advantages and disadvantages of using Styrofoam and plastic for food service containers. And some of the benefits of using Styrofoam and plastic food containers are that in the case of Styrofoam, they are heat resistant. In addition, styrofoam and plastic food service containers can hold heavy oily products without leaking or tearing. They are not chemically reactive or conducive to bacterial growth, thus making them sanitary and safe, and can be produced at a very, very low cost. On the other hand, styrofoam and plastic food service containers are not biodegradable and persist in the environment after disposal. These food service containers also constitute thousands of tons of waste each year. It causes litter buildup in drains, resulting in cleanup costs and litter on our beaches, which can have an impact on tourism. Other negative impacts of using styrofoam and plastic food service containers are that they cause marine pollution and have a detrimental effect on wildlife and are very difficult to recycle. The negative environmental impacts of styrofoam and plastic food service containers has led to the adoption of various measures to eliminate its use. St. Lucia has therefore become part of the Clean Seas campaign and ratified the Land-Based Pollution Protocol of the Cartagena Convention, together with the 11 other Caribbean countries, including Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. The use of acceptable alternatives is encouraged under the bill. Therefore, the bill encourages food businesses to use containers made from a biological base resource that is composable in a facility or garden, compostable. These containers are already available in St. Lucia, and some food businesses have started using them. All food businesses are expected to apply the provisions of this bill. However, the bill identifies full-service restaurants, fast food restaurants, grocery stores, supermarkets, food vans, and other mobile food facilities, vendors who sell food on trays or other similar devices. Cafeteria and processing plants are some of the businesses that the bill will affect. A phased approach is used to eliminate the use of styrofoam and plastic food service containers in the bill. Essentially, the bill prevents the importation of styrofoam, disposable plates, disposable trays, disposable hinge takeaways, containers, disposable bowls, and plastic disposable cups, disposable plates, disposable beverage cup lids, and disposable bowl lids from the 1st of August 2019. And the importation of plastic disposable forks, disposable spoons, disposable knives, disposable straws, disposable hinge takeaway containers, disposable plates, disposable trays, disposable stirrers, and styrofoam disposable egg cartons must stop from 1st August 2020 in phase 1. In phase 2, Mr. Speaker, the manufacture, sale, use, distribution, and sale of food in styrofoam and plastic food service containers are prohibited for styrofoam disposable plates, disposable trays, disposable hinge takeaway containers, disposable bowls, plastic disposable cups, disposable plates, disposable beverage cup lids, and disposable bowl lids from the 1st August 2020. And for the plastic disposable forks, disposable spoons, disposable knives, disposable trays, disposable hinge takeaway containers, disposable bowls, disposable trays, disposable stirrers, and styrofoam disposable egg cartons from 1st August 2021. It is expected, Mr. Speaker, that by 1st August 2021, the styrofoam and plastic food service containers would have been eradicated in St. Lucia. Praise the Lord. The bill does not restrict the use of disposable plastic bags, disposable wrap, or disposable straws used with Tetra Pak boxes. Enforced measures are included in the bill as well. A food business must make a declaration to the Department of Sustainable Development indicating the number and types of styrofoam and plastic food service containers that the food business has when the legislation comes into force. Authorized officers identified in the bill are empowered to enter and seize styrofoam and plastic food service containers that are being used contrary to the provisions of the bill. Criminal offenses have also been created with fines ranging from $3,000 to $15,000. A person who commits an offense under the bill must also pay the cost of storage and disposal. Mr. Speaker, I commend the bill to this House.
Honourable members, the question is that styrofoam and plastic food service containers prohibition bill be read a second time. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate I want to congratulate the Minister of Sustainable Development for bringing this bill to the House. I think that the timeliness is critical, and it even falls on the heels of the conversation that the member from Cascades North was having with regards to the amount of garbage that we have around this island. This is a very serious matter, and I think that the environmental impact that these products have been having have been long understated and long misunderstood. Even when I speak to divers, the amount of garbage now that is accumulating in our reefs, I'm sure many people have seen the TV ads and certainly the understanding that even straws that are being eaten by fish or eaten by birds, and the damage that it's creating to our natural life is overwhelming. And the fact is that the garbage dumps that we currently have, in which we're putting products in that will take hundreds of years to actually decompose, is adding to the problem that we're having in this country. So the most difficult aspect of this is to get everybody to accept the change. And I know that we had an earlier date for the implementation, and I know through consultation, the minister and the private sector and many of our partners agreed to the new dates, and I would like to think that we're going to stick to that timeline in the implementation of these changes. And the fact is that they're readily available substitutes. You take, for instance, a plastic straw, easily can be substituted with a paper straw. And getting into the habit of, like how we go to the grocery store with our own bag, that we now start going to places with our own container to be able to get a cup of coffee, to be able to get water, and so that we're not continuously disposing the product that we've had. We have to take our environment very seriously. And while we're not going to be able to solve the problem by ourselves, but I am extremely encouraged by the movement that's taking place throughout the length and breadth of the world, of countries that are moving very quickly in order to implement this same legislation. And I would like to think that the Caribbean is going to be one of the leaders in that, and that St. Lucia will play its role. So again, let me commend to the Minister for the work that she and her ministry have done, and I'm looking forward to the support of the general public in implementing these new policies as quickly as possible.
Honourable members, the question is that the styrofoam and plastic food service containers prohibition bill be read a second time. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to ban the importation, manufacturing, sale, use or distribution of styrofoam and plastic food service containers, and for related matters.
Honorable members, clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Clause 3.
Binding of the Crown.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill. Clause 4.
Non-application of this Act.
Clause 4 stands part of this bill. Clause 5.
Prohibition on import and styrofoam and plastic food service containers.
Clause 5 stands part of the bill. Clause 6.
Prohibition on manufacture, sale, use, and distribution.
Clause 6 stands part of the bill. Clause 7.
Prohibition of sale of food in styrofoam and plastic food service container.
Clause 7 stands part of the bill. Clause 8.
Declaration and reduction measures.
Clause 8 stands part of the bill. Clause 9.
Power to enter and seize.
Clause 9 stands part of the bill. Clause 10.
Disposal.
Clause 10 stands part of the bill. Clause 11.
Cost of storage and disposal.
Clause 11 stands part of the bill. Clause 12.
Amendment of schedule.
Clause 12 stands part of the bill. Clause 13.
Regulations.
Clause 13 stands part of the bill. Schedule.
Sections 2, 5, 6, and 7, food service container.
Schedule stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Member, Honorable Minister for Youth Development and Sports.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the chairman's report be adopted and the bill be read a third time and pass.
Honorable members, the question is that a report of the committee be adopted and that the Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition Bill be read a third time and pass. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This Act may be cited as the Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition Act 2019.
Minister for Equity.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for first reading a bill shortly entitled St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill.
St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment.
Minister for Equity.
Mr. Speaker, I beg for the suspension of Standing Order 48-2 to allow for the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order number 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leave is granted. Proceed, Honorable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present for second reading the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill amends the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Act Cap 16.05 to correct the reference to the Poverty Reduction Fund in the Act and to reflect its redesignation as the St. Lucia Social Development Fund, and to provide for a new source of revenue for the St. Lucia Social Development Fund. The Act was amended by the Poverty Reduction Fund Amendment Act number 4 of 2009 to replace references to the Poverty Reduction Fund Act with the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Act in the title and other parts of the Act. However, Mr. Speaker, some references to the Poverty Reduction Fund were not addressed by this amendment and consequently remained in the Act. Therefore, it is necessary to amend the long title and sections 2 and 3 of the Act to correct the inconsistencies in the references to the Poverty Reduction Fund in the Act to reflect its designation as the St. Lucia Social Development Fund. Mr. Speaker, basically in 2009, during my tenure as Minister of Social Transformation, we brought about an amalgamation of the of the Poverty Reduction Fund and it was Basic Needs Trust Fund, and the Basic Needs Trust Fund to create a new entity called the St. Lucia Social Development Fund, which in effect provided the services that the two entities provided and to consolidate and to reduce expenditure in terms of administration and so on. And so this amendment will ensure that we do not continue to make reference to the Poverty Reduction Fund that is now redundant with the emergence of the St. Lucia Social Development Fund. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the St. Lucia Social Development Fund frequently receives non-monetary donations such as clothing, housewares, and other thrift shop items. While these items automatically become the property of the fund, the Act did not recognize the revenue generated from the sale of this property. A new paragraph is therefore inserted under Section 16 of the Act to include revenue received from the sale of property as a new revenue source fund. Mr. Speaker, I present this amendment to the House and hope that I get its full support for those changes to take effect. Thank you.
Honorable members, the question is that the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill be read a second time. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to amend the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Act Cap 16.05.
Honorable members, clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Aye. Clause 3.
Amendment of long title.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill. Aye. Clause 4.
Amendment to section 2.
Clause 4 stands part of the bill. Aye. Clause 5.
Amendment to section 3.
Clause 5 stands part of the bill. Aye. Clause 6.
Amendment of section 16.
Clause 6 stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Minister for Equity, Social Justice, and Local Government and Empowerment.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the chairman's report be adopted and the bill be read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment Act 2019.
Honorable Minister for Equity, Social Justice, Local Government and Empowerment.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for first reading a bill shortly entitled Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Bill.
Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment.
Honorable Minister for Equity, Social Justice, Local Government and Empowerment.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order 48-2 to enable the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honorable members, the question is that Standing Order number 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Honorable Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leave is granted. Proceed, Honorable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present for second reading a bill entitled Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment. Mr. Speaker, under the repealed act, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the bill, first of all, is to amend the Child Care Protection and Adoption Act number 8 of 2018. This act, which essentially replaced the Adoption Act Cap 4.07 and was repealed just last year. Under the repealed act, an adoption order was processed through the High Court. However, when the act came into force in December 2018, an adoption order would be dealt with primarily by an adoption committee. As such, the act provides an entirely new process for dealing with an application for an adoption order. Although the act requires the establishment of an adoption committee and a director of human services for full implementation, this has not been the case. Currently, the post for a director of human services remains vacant and the adoption committee has not been established. Only recently, Mr. Speaker, we appointed an acting director of human services. And like I indicated, we have not as yet established an adoption committee. Mr. Speaker, this state of affairs has led to uncertainty in relation to the processing of new applications for an adoption under the Act. Members of the legal fraternity and the public in general are left in doubt, not knowing how to continue and proceed with an application for an adoption order. Therefore, to assist with administering the Act, it is recommended that the Act be amended to introduce a separate division that contains the provisions of the repealed Act in relation to an adoption order by the High Court. By doing so, Mr. Speaker, persons would have an alternative avenue to continue processing applications for an adoption order made under the repealed Act. Additionally, a new application for an adoption order can be dealt with by the High Court in the absence of an adoption committee and a director of human services. Consequently, the High Court may make an order authorizing a person who is a citizen of St. Lucia or who is domiciled or has resided in St. Lucia for at least 6 consecutive months prior to the date of application to adopt an infant. Mr. Speaker, other provisions that were previously featured in the repealed Act are now reintroduced in the Act as sections 118A to 118S to clarify the process involved when an adoption order has to be made by the High Court. These provisions include the restrictions that may apply on making an order, the requirements for consent to an adoption, and the evidence required for proving consent of a parent or guardian. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, provisions that set out the functions of the court in relation to an adoption order, interim order, affiliation order, the jurisdiction, procedure, and the rules of the court are included, while provisions with respect to existing de facto adoptions, rights and duties of parents, and the capacity to marry, intestacy, will, settlement, and other provisions relating to successions and the devolution of property also form part of this new division of the Act. While this new division is introduced in the Act, the amendment makes it clear that once the adoption committee is established, the continuation of an application or a new application for an adoption order will be dealt by the committee. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, Section 126 of the Act becomes unnecessary and is deleted, since the transitional matters would have already been dealt with by the amendment to the Act. Mr. Speaker, I present to the Honorable House this Act, and I implore my colleagues to give support to the amendment and approve the amendment as stated in this presentation. Thank you.
Honorable members, the question is that the Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Bill be read a second time. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
An act to amend the Child Care Protection and Adoption Act number 8 of 2018.
Honorable members, Clause 2.
Interpretation.
Clause 2 stands part of the bill. Just give me. Clause 3.
Amendment of Part 6.
Clause 3 stands part of the bill. Clause 1.
Short title.
Clause 1 stands part of the bill. Honorable members, the question is that the committee rises and the bill be reported. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Honorable members, I beg to report that the Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Bill went through committee stage with no amendments. Honorable Minister for Equity, Social Justice, Local Government and Empowerment.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the chairman's report be adopted and that the bill be read a third time and passed.
Honorable members, the question is that the report of the committee be adopted and that the Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Bill be read a third time and passed. I now put a question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. As many as are of a contrary opinion, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty by and with the advice and consent of the House of Assembly and the Senate of St. Lucia, and by the authority of the same as follows. This act may be cited as the Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Act 2019.
Honorable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I move that the House stand adjourned, sine die.
Honorable members, the question is that the House do stand adjourned, sine die. I now put the question. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. As many as of a contrary opinions, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. House is adjourned.
Ladies and gentlemen, the House has now been adjourned, sine die, and we'll just give you a quick wrap-up before we close our broadcast here this evening on today's sitting of the Lower House, the House of Assembly, Tuesday, June 11th, 2019, and in our latter stages this evening, we had the third motion tabled today that Parliament by affirmative resolution approves the draft value-added tax amendment of Schedule 3, order which amends Schedule 3 of the Act to exempt the import of goods or services for the UNORA International Airport Redevelopment Project, and that's for a period of 4 years and 1 month commencing from the 1st day of June 2018 and terminating on the 30th day of June 2022. Then we went into the presentation of a number of bills, and there were 5 presented by the Honorable Prime Minister, Minister for Finance, Economic Growth, Job Creation, External Affairs, and the Public Service, Alan Chasney. There were the Income Tax Amendment number 2, the International Business Companies Amendment number 2, and what really brought about some really contentious debate today, the St. Lucia National Economic Fund. And we can tell you that all these went through the committee stage with no amendments. And we also had the Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Serious Criminal Matters, and also the Public Health Amendment. And it was during that debate we told you on the St. Lucia National Economic Fund that the members of the opposition took their leave. And there was a presentation by the member for Denry South, and he's also the Minister for Youth Development and Sports, the Honorable Edmund Estefan, on behalf of the Minister for Education, Innovation, Gender Relations and Sustainable Development, Dr. Gail Rigobert, who was unavailable for that presentation this evening, and that was on the Styrofoam and Plastic Food Service Containers Prohibition Act, and the final 2 bills presented here this evening to close today's debate by the Honorable Minister for Equity, Social Justice, Local Government and Empowerment, Honorable Leonard Mortut, and his presentations of bills today included the St. Lucia Social Development Fund Amendment and also the Child Care Protection and Adoption Amendment Act. We can tell you that the invocation of 48.2 suspended today to allow the ministers to seek leave of the House to enable these bills to have gone through all their stages at this sitting. So on behalf of all of us here at the Parliament buildings, the entire crew of the Government Information Service, I'm Ryan O'Brien saying good night from Parliament.